Believe it or not, the cyberpunk universe is actually the same as our universe, but with a few slight changes. These slight changes have completely altered the course of the world, and that's why in Cyberpunk 2077 they have all of this different type of cyberware, this technology. So in this video we are going to be going through the whole timeline so that we can point out the key points of when the timeline started to change. If you would like to see any more content from me, there is a number of links in the description down below. The one that I would like to point out is the Twitch. I stream every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. So if you want to talk a bit more about Cyberpunk, then there is a link to that in the description down below. Getting back into the video, for this I will be focusing on the main events that happen in America. This timeline has a number of different things that happen across the whole world, but as Cyberpunk 2077 is set in America, I thought it would be best to focus on that, and a lot happens there. If I included other countries, this may even turn out to be a 30, maybe even 40-minute video. But if you do want to see other countries, I will get separate videos done on it. So the timeline starts to alter all the way back in the 1800s. This is when certain characters were born. Not characters that will be in Cyberpunk 2077, but characters that started a family name. So you have Sasai Arasaka, Yui, and Akio Nagawa, which I'm sure a lot of you may realize turns out to be mega corporations and big family names within the future. But these aren't major changes, and this does also happen throughout the whole of the 1900s. As said at the beginning, the Cyberpunk universe is very similar to our universe, except it starts to have a few slight changes later. But that does also mean there's a lot of similarities. So key events being World War I and World War II did happen. You had the Cold War ending and also the Berlin Wall falling. All of these were key events. But towards the end of the 1980s, things started to change. In 1989, the Gang of Four was created. This was a group made up of the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, and the DEA. They formed together to secretly run the United States of America behind the president's back. This later leads to the first Central American conflict in 1990. It was branded as a war on drugs and communism, but this was just a way for the United States to invade countries south of the border. Many soldiers came back injured, losing limbs, and this created a demand for cyberware. By 1992, the US take the war on drugs a step further by spreading designer plagues worldwide. They specifically target coca and opium plants, leading to the collapse of governments in Chile, Ecuador, and beyond. Already at this point, the world was starting to fall apart, and this did not take long for this to backfire on America, because 1 year later in 1993, drug lords became very mad at America that a small yield nuclear device is detonated in New York City, killing 15,000 people. Colombian drug lords are to blame, and this is retaliation for the US war on drugs. This is when America really started to collapse, because following this event in New York City with 15,000 people killed, by 1994 the world stock market collapsed, and this is when the first Central American conflict ends. America is just completely in chaos, and between the years of 1994 and 1996, gangs really started to rise up, and this is where we start to see gangs really controlling massive areas. The Bloods gang controlled the whole of Miami and Florida. By 1996, this ultimately leads to the collapse of America. 1 in 4 Americans become homeless, martial law is established, gangs pop up with alarming regularity, and this is when it leaves the board completely clear for mega corporations to rise up. And what really put the nail in the coffin by 1996 is the president and vice president are killed. And jumping very slightly ahead here, it isn't found out until 2004, but the NSA was behind the deaths of the president and vice president, one of the cornerstones of the Gang of Four. So we can see that the moment that the Gang of Four were first formed to the point of 1996, it really did lead to a very dark place, to the point of where the whole of America did collapse. By 1997, the Gang of Four are formally investigated, and this investigation does last for quite some time. It goes on for around 10 to 20 years, and at this point in 1997, not much information is known about the Gang of Four, and things are pretty rough at this point, but it just progressively gets worse. In 1998, a 10.5 earthquake decimates Los Angeles. 35% of the city is underwater and upwards of 65,000 people are killed. This is a natural disaster and not something that is formed by what has already been created, which was behind America's doing. But because at this point America has collapsed, there's no government in place, there's no aid for these states that are struggling, and that led to a very high number in people dying. Also in 1998, there was a drought in the Midwest destroying a large amount of crops. Many farms go out of business and a food supply is very low. And whilst people are trying to get through these very hard times over the last 10 to 11 years, by 2000 there was a wasting plague that spreads across America and Europe, which infected many families. And this is when you started to see mega corporations come in. And this is when they started to realize the power, because in 2001 they saw the creation of the WorldSat and the net, which radically altering both American and global communications, business and culture for decades to come. And even though you probably are not too familiar with this is Cyberpunk's version of the internet. Now their internet is widely different. It is 100% controlled by mega corporations. And as the net evolves over the coming years, you start to realize that mega corporations have a very clear understanding in the people that use it. Restrictions are made so they can only do certain things, and mega corporations will just study everything you do. They'll analyze everything that you use, and this was so that they can then understand you as a person and then use that to then finance their own corporation, which made their corporation even more powerful. In 2002, the food crash occurs. This was crops around the world are hit by a new virus. The United States survives after developing a counter-agent, but many people believe that this was biological warfare, but no one understood who it could have possibly been. By 2003, the second Central American conflict kicks off with the US invading Venezuela and beyond. You would have thought maybe America would have learned from their first Central American conflict, as that did end in a complete disaster. But no, this also ended in a complete disaster. Many US soldiers were abandoned, left to find their own ways home, very similar to the First War. It led soldiers losing their limbs, which created a demand for cyberware again. Also in 2003, the Gang of Four is exposed by reporters, and with this, democracy returns to America, but it is under a watchful eye of megacorporations. Megacorporations have full control here, and this is when they really start to see how much power they can have. Because by 2004, the first corporate war begins. Every single one of these corporate wars was there to fight for power, to fight for supplies. And the first one is no different. This was a war between Euro Business Machines, also known as EBM, and Orbital Air. And it was all because a deal fell through with Transworld Airlines. And this ultimately became a war between the two corporations. And it affected the whole world. The result ended up being Orbital Air winning. But this did last for 2 years. In 2004 as well, you had the CIA and the army unite to finish off the Gang of Four. By 2006, the first corporate war ends, and also the first common clone is grown. This leads to the development of artificial organs. 2006 also brought the cyber limbs to the military. As mentioned before, between the two previous American conflicts, there was a very high demand for soldiers needing cyberware because of losing limbs. This is when cyberware started to come in. Fast forwarding to 2008, the second corporate war begins, and this was a large-scale armed conflict fought between April 2008 and August 2010. The main corporations were two oil corporations, Sovoil and Petrochem. Both of these companies were going to have a partnership, and they were so close to signing a deal, but Sovoil engineers announced that they had developed drilling technology, which was the technology that Petrochem was going to offer as part of the deal. And because they developed that technology, it made the deal pointless. By 2007, both companies began to expand into the South China Seas. This created tension and eventually boiled over to begin the second corporate war. They were fighting over resources, and just like the first corporate war, this was incredibly bloody. In 2008 as well, you also had the orbital war. This was United States forcing attacks on Soviet space installations. The Eurospace Agency joins the conflict on the side of the Soviets and ends after the intervention by the lunar colony. There was also a point in 2008 where the United States government goes under a period of reform. In 2010, the second Central American conflict and the second corporate war ends. At this point as well, Network 54 now owns 62% of media output in the United States. We're getting close to a full-on dystopia by this point. Human cloning also becomes viable, but the bodies have no soul. They're used as spare body parts for the rich. This is where we see the biggest changes of Cyberpunk. For the last 20 years, there's been chaos upon chaos upon chaos, which has just opened doors for mega corporations. At this point within the timeline, we're going to be starting jumping over a bit. So from 2010, we're going to be going to 2012. A bioplague is unleashed in Chicago. 1,700 people are killed. In 2013, the events of Cyberpunk 2013 take place, and the first artificial intelligence is developed by Microtech. By 2016, the third corporate war begins, but this is unlike the previous corporate wars, because the previous corporate wars were fought in person. Many people died, and it was an outright war with weapons. This was mainly fought on the net. This whole war sparked up with Merrill, Asuga, and Finch, and the Rothstein Fund. In 2017, we have the first self-aware human clone is created, and NASA launches a mission to Mars. In 2019, NASA's Mars mission is successful. We also start to see this point of rumors coming around about potentially having space station and living on Mars. There was already an orbital war previous to this, so many people saw the potential of being out in space. The events that I'm going to be talking about now are going to be between 2020 to 2030. There's still a decent amount here, but between these 10 years compared to the previous 10 years and the previous 10 years before that, there's still not as much. So between the years of 2020 and 2030, you have the events of Cyberpunk 2020 taking place. NASA builds a base on Mars. It's called the Christ Base. The events of Cyberpunk the Arasaka's plot take place. The fourth corporate war occurs, fought by rival megacorporations Arasaka and Militech. Industrial factories appear in orbit around Mars, and NASA start offering commercial flights to Mars. But they do not stop there. NASA also launches a mission to Jupiter to replicate the exact same thing. By 2025, the fourth corporate war ends. We see that NASA's Jupiter mission is successful. NASA tried to replicate this again with NASA and the Japanese Aerospace Bureau launching a joint mission to Saturn. And we start to see the United States is starting to function as a dictatorship under President Elizabeth Crest's state of emergency. Between the years of 2030 going all the way up to 2077, things started to settle down. That doesn't mean that things weren't bad, but at this point the timeline was already set. Cyberware was at a very high, which started as a demand for soldiers after the end of the Central American conflicts. The corporate wars were absolutely massive. Some fought in person, one of them fought on the net, but we started to see that megacorporations were rising to the top. For a small part in the middle, before megacorporations started to realize the power, gangs were fighting their way through. And because of all of that within the middle, you had a lot of people moving out the cities and heading towards Mexico City. These later turned into the nomads. Some of these people started to come back between 2030 to 2077, which just made business flourish as mega corporations can now start to get money off in them. We start to see the first mega buildings constructed to handle population growth. You see the rebuilding of old factories and old tech begins to be replaced as new corporations begin to rise up, and this was just an evolution of growing. At 2047, you do have the birth of Jackie Wells, which is V's best friend within Cyberpunk 2077, and V, the main character of Cyberpunk 2077, is born in 2054. In 2062, an event took place in another country, being Haiti, but this did affect America, because Haiti was officially abandoned after a series of vicious storms, but a lot of the Haitians did move over to America. And if you have seen the gangs video already that I uploaded this week, you'll understand understand that the Voodoo Boys at the beginning was predominantly white males, but in 2062, with Haitians moving over to America, the Haitians ended up just completely flooding the Voodoo Boys so that it became a predominantly Haitian gang. And this brings us all the way to the point of 2077. Now this was predominantly the timeline just for America, and you can see how in depth it is, and it has been a fairly long video. If I included the other countries as well, we probably would have hit 40, 50, maybe even the hour mark. But each country does have its own story, some of which has been affected by America. There's also a very specific timeline for Night City, the city in which Cyberpunk 2077 takes place. So you could just see how crazy in depth Cyberpunk is. But anyway, that is the timeline for America within the Cyberpunk universe. It started on the exact same timeline as us, but with a few slight changes in the middle between the 1980s that led Cyberpunk being on a completely different timeline. If you do want to talk more in depth about the Cyberpunk timeline, you can find a link in the description down below, which will take you over to the Twitch stream. I stream every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Head over to there, drop a follow, and you'll be notified the next time I go live. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did enjoy, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. But for now, I'm going. So see ya.